This afternoon, it really is my pleasure to introduce Chris Dorland. Now, a lot of you know that I myself became interested in digital art and digital media, or what we used to call new media art, when I was in grad school in 1993. So it's been a minute. That was when we started to read in the newspaper about this thing called the internet and the World Wide Web. And I got interested in virtual reality. I started reading all these, what they called cyberpunk novels, a genre of science fiction, including novels by like Neil Stevenson. He wrote this one called Snow Crash, that you may have heard of, called Neuromancer, by a Canadian author, William Gibson. I imagined the internet as this, William Gibson called it a consensual hallucination, but it's a kind of virtual world, what now some people, including Chris, call the metaverse. I think Facebook also calls it the metaverse, right? Yeah. But as this immersive world that you would navigate almost sort of like flying through space. As it turned out, it became more like a bunch of pages that you would click through. And then increasingly we saw more and more video. But at that time, in the mid and late 1990s, artists all over the world, myself included, were really excited by the potential of the internet as a new kind of space in which artists could do stuff, make art, share art, stage interventions. And I think a lot of us, myself included, had the sense that it was about to change everything, all kinds of interactions and the way that people communicated and did business and entertained themselves. We couldn't have really, foreseen things like, swipe right, swipe left to meet people. In any case, it was, my interests have gotten broader, but I've remained interested in the term that I think really has stuck is digital art ever since. And it was sort of with that enduring interest that I noticed a panel discussion at the gallery Lyles and King on the Lower East Side, taking place, I think it was in August last summer, maybe late July, hot New York summer. There were all these fires up in Canada. The streets were full of not only smoke, but literally, I remember going down to like Henry Street, wherever Lyles and King is, and there were ashes floating through the air. And I was thinking, okay, there's not going to be anybody here. It was Chris Dorland, and another artist whose work I'm really interested in, Rachel Rawson, and then a third one I hadn't heard of, and an art historian from Montclair State University, I think, right?
The editor at large.
And the editor at large of the book and Rail. What was her name? Charlotte Kent, right, thanks.
And Peter's.
Okay, Peter Schoolworth. So 3 artists and art historian, editor, curator, to talk about this show that was up at Lyles and King, which was also really interesting, which I won't go into, but I was really surprised that the room, by the time, the start had rolled around, was packed. It's really full. How do you get the gallery to fill up with people on, it was like a Friday night in the end of July, when half of New York seems to be out of town fleeing heat? It was a sign to me that there was a lot of interest in Chris's work and Rachel's work and Peter's work. And I thought at the end of that panel to invite Chris, because I've been interested in his work for quite a while, but I also just noticed how much he seemed to have to say in a good way both through his work and also, you know, with words, and what a good communicator he is. I know a lot of you, you know, are painting, but are also interested in the way that painting intersects with other art forms and digital media in general. So I feel like his work is going to be relevant for a lot of you. Chris Dorland is a Canadian-American artist who lives and works here in New York City. He makes paintings. I might call them prints, but, you know, flat works that are made with a UV printer that function in some ways like paintings, installations and screen-based works that explore the ways in which machines perceive the world, record it, and reproduce it or represent it through data visualization, scanning machines, and optics, different kinds of lenses and computer vision. He's been busy these last several years with solo exhibitions at Lyles and King, at Super Dakota in Brussels. Is it Nicolas Robert or Nicholas Robert in Montreal?
I guess.
Is he Anglophone? I don't know. Okay. Anyways, Robert, okay. At Nicoletti Contemporary in, I guess that's in London. Yeah. Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in Santiago, Chile. Impacto in Lima, Peru. Wiggleman Gallery, may it rest in peace, here in New York, good gallery. Rona Hoffman Gallery in Chicago. Marc Selwyn Fine Art in LA. And Wendy Cooper Gallery in Chicago. A bunch of group shows, including at the University of Exeter in the UK, Kraftwerk Berlin, Annka Kultys Gallery, and the Wrong Biennial, which is online, the Museum of Contemporary Digital Art, MOCDA, also online, PMAM in London, the Cleveland Triennial for Contemporary Art in Ohio, Carriage Trade here in New York, the Code Art Fair in Copenhagen, Osmos in New York. You guys will remember Felipe Ujica's presentation, and he was introduced by Christian of Osmos, and his show was at Osmos. Martos Gallery in LA, Anonymous Gallery in Mexico City, Marianne Boski here in New York, along with I-20, the Suburban in Oak Park, Illinois, the Neuberger Museum at Purchase, and Gavin Brown's Passerby, which was at one point pretty much the coolest bar in New York City, maybe. I don't know. It was a cool one. His work has been supported by Canada Council for the Arts twice, by the Pollock Krasner Foundation, Marie Mann Foundation, and Marie Walsh Sharp Art Foundation. His work's been reviewed and discussed in the Brooklyn Rail, Two Coats of Paint, Frieze, Art News, Art Critical, Collector Daily, Elephant, the New York Times, The Verge, and Paper Magazine. His work is in the collections of the Whitney Museum, the Bronx Museum, the Neuberger Museum, the Juilliard School, and the Sigg Art Foundation, an important private collection in Switzerland. He is represented by 3 galleries, Lyles and King here in New York, Super Dakota in Brussels, and Nicoletti in London. And he also serves as director at large at Magenta Plains, a very cool gallery on the Lower East Side. He earned a BFA in painting from Purchase of the State University of New York. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Chris Dorland.
Thank you all, and thank you, Marc. That was a really nice and generous introduction. I guess there's a couple of things I just wanted to start, like when we had a blank screen, and just give you guys like a little bit of background on myself and how I came to be here in front of you guys today. I guess first and foremost, I could say, like, I've been obsessed with the idea of the future ever since I was a little kid. Like, so young, I don't know why. I don't really know where it came from. Thinking about it this week, putting together the presentation, you know, I think the myth of the future is something that has lived as alongside capitalism, and is sort of in our psyche. And, you know, my development, I'm hitting, this is like a 20-year mark. What we're going to look at is about 20 years of painting from my earliest development when I was probably even maybe younger than you guys, in my early 20s, up until now. And, you know, I came of age as a kid in the 80s into the 90s. And I feel sort of always being aware of the future, that we, as a little kid, I was really excited about what the future would be and would become. And, seeing the future present itself in the present was really exciting to me. And I feel like my artistic development happens within the last 20 years and, me moving to New York. And basically, while I was in school, 9/11 happened. 10 years later, not even the financial crisis happened, which some of you may be too young to have fully experienced it, but it was like incredible. All of a sudden banks were going out of business left and right. And it was a real moment of, oh my God, like this system is so fragile. And then the pandemic. So it's kind of in light of that my artistic development really kind of happens, is with these like 20 years of like major shocks to the system. And in some ways, the vision or the myth of the future is no longer really an optimistic one. It's kind of a terrifying one. I as a kid who really always wanted to live in the future, I feel like I live in the future, and it's like freaks me out. And the last thing I just want to say is about painting. So I've always really heavily identified as a painter. I think at this point, I operate in kind of an expanded field of painting, meaning that I work with video, I work with installation, but everything that I'm going to show you guys really is through the lens of a painting sensibility, and someone who's really thought a lot about painting, how to make a painting. I kind of think of myself as a technical painter, meaning that I create a system for myself as a way to make images, and then I work through a point of exhaustion, at which point I'm kind of done with that body of work, and then I move on to creating a new system. So with that, I have a couple of images that are kind of like how we get to my work, and then we're just going to go through the work, and I'm going to try to be as quick as I can here. And if Marc, if at the 35-minute mark, you could just give me a heads up so that I have a sense of, how I'm doing. So this is before I was born. This is the Buckminster Fuller Dome. It's the biosphere. It's now a museum, but this is my hometown of Montreal, where I grew up. This event here, this fire, is 2 years before I was even conceived. And this piece of architecture was created as part of like a World's Fair. And I'm just going to give you guys like a quick, brief description, because you might not know what that was. But for about 100 years, from the turn of the 19th century through the 2000s, there were these global events, and they were called World's Fairs, and they would happen in big cities, and they were a huge production architecturally. The Eiffel Tower comes out of a World's Fair. It was meant to be a temporary thing, and it's now the crown jewel of France, but it was really intended to be a thing that they were going to knock down after it was built. And the city, so Montreal, where I grew up, the entire modern infrastructure of the city was built for Expo 67, which again, well before I was born. But the remnants still existed, and as a little kid in the 80s, I would sort of see them, and they seemed to me like the future. They were strange, circular round domes. Some of them were like blocks, and they were really kind of powerful images. And some of the first images, I think I was aware that I was feeling something while looking at them. This particular dome that I never liked, I don't really like round things, and it was right next to the amusement park. And in the 80s, I have this very, very distinct memory. I've said it numerous times over the years in interviews and stuff, but and it was just this rusted hunk of shit, really. And it was just sitting there, it was abandoned. And I remember being with my dad and saying, "What is that?" And he was a very dry response, and he just said, "It's crap from the 70s." And that really stayed with me. It made me kind of dislike the 70s, and also really dislike this thing. This is another image of the dome. So the story behind the dome is that it actually has a great story, which I'll get into a little bit later. But in the 70s, they were renovating it, and they were trying to clean it up, and it was covered in this new plastic, and a spark went off during the renovation, and they torched it by mistake, and the whole thing went down in flames. Hence me in the mid 80s asking my dad what it is, and he's like, "It's just a hunk of junk." I love this slide. It's like a really beautiful, I mean, you can really feel the power of that fire. So next, I'm not gonna talk, I have a couple slides of movies. And I'm going to show you, I don't want to get into them, and that's its own presentation, but just images that, like, as a kid, my parents were pretty lax, and I was allowed to watch movies. It was like the dawn of VHS tapes. And at like 6 years old, most of the movies I'm going to show you, I saw them between 6 and 8 on VHS, and they were just such powerful images for me, and they just burnt into my psyche. And I mean, I think to this day, I'm still kind of working through these images. So this is Terminator 1982, James Cameron. Blade Runner, also 1982, Ridley Scott. This is Total Recall, 1990, Paul Verhoeven. There's 3 images here. They're all RoboCop from 1987. RoboCop here is the only movie I actually saw in the theater with my dad. I was 8 years old. Even as a kid, I loved this. There's this advertisement for the future. It's this future city that ends up, I'm not going to get into it, but there's this advertisement for this dystopian downtown that shows up recurringly, and it's the future has a silver lining. And I love that. This is the David Cronenberg, The Fly, 1987. Manhunter, Michael Mann, 1986. Thief, 1981, also Michael Mann. I was just going to say with Michael Mann that there's this kind of really painterly sensibility to his movies that are so mood evoking that really had a very, I mean, all these movies in various ways had really profound influences on how I thought of the world, but Michael Mann's visual sensibility, very much so. And the last thing I'm just going to talk about, this is where I went to school. This is a model of where I went to school, which is Purchase College, as Marc mentioned. And this is again, long even before the school was created, but in 1971, the Museum of Modern Art. So Purchase, for those of you that may know or not, it's about 45 minutes north of here in Westchester, in a small town called Purchase, New York. And it's part of the SUNY system, and they had really big vision for this to become like this major art school for New York State. And the model was exhibited at MoMA. This is at the Museum of Modern Art. And, you know, major 20th century architects were all part of designing it. Philip Johnson, Venturi, Charles Wathme. And they had this idea that a whole town would flourish around the university. But what ended up happening is that they built the college, and immediately all the adjacent land got bought by corporate. PepsiCo has a huge amount of the property, and it sort of isolated the school, and the hope that it would sort of flourish didn't happen. And it ended up becoming kind of in the 80s, a sort of a drug school. And it kind of failed in that sense. It was sort of a utopian vision that really failed. Of course, I went there in the early 2000s, but I think I learned a lot from that experience and from being there and from kind of feeling that failure, that the potential of something that could have been that didn't end up being. So now we're going to start with the first kind of body of work that I'd made many paintings prior to this, but this is like the first painting that I really feel like I made that I was proud of. I was at Purchase when I made it. And I'd been making a lot of different kinds of painting, all of it photo-based. But what happened with this painting is that I was looking at these images of World's Fairs, and I was realizing that I grew up in a place. Suddenly I could connect to where I grew up by virtue of how important that had been to the city. And I found a new way to access that architecture. Being at Purchase, feeling like this is a weird campus that's kind of both modern, but also it's not really functioning properly. The campus is really weird. It's super isolated. And I was just looking at archival images and making paintings. I was making paintings of lots of different images, but I stumbled on this one image, and it was the Firestone Pavilion from the 1939 New York's World Fair. And, these postcards and stuff, they're really amazing. I mean, there's really this glorious vision for like a utopian future. But at the time that I was making the painting in 2000 or 2001, Firestone was in the news because they were dealing with a lawsuit because they realized that they had faulty tires and that the tires could potentially kill people. But they did the math and like it was cheaper to just deal with people getting injured and suing them than it was to do an actual recall. And that really, like, in that moment, I felt like I just understood something about, you know, capitalism and hope and the future and the past. And it felt like, you know, almost like Terminator, you know, which is like someone from the future coming back to the past. I felt like I could relate to making images in a way that was really meaningful to me. And I think like that's kind of the most important thing in an artist's development is just finding your own meaning in things. And it's that meaning that kind of moves you through your career and your commitment because, you know, I mean, that meaning is about kind of all there is really. So once this painting happened, it's almost like I found my voice and I just started developing paintings. So this is a large watercolor, the dome. But at this point, I no longer like hated the dome. I actually had a lot of fondness for the dome because I started learning what it was. And it was designed by a very visionary engineer architect called Buckminster Fuller, who's amazing. And this is actually, I think, the biggest dome that he invented. He sort of pioneered the geodesic dome. And so kind of like teaching myself how to paint at this point, this whole body of work. This is the inside of the dome. And it was also the US Pavilion, which I didn't realize, but it was filled with like amazing art. So you can kind of see them. It's sort of abstracted in the work on paper, but you know, there's Warhol at the top, there's a big Jasper Johns flag. There's a Barnett Newman, and it was just amazing to me that this thing that I had spent a lot of my teenage years like thinking is just like the dumbest thing in Montreal growing up, like turned out to be like so filled with incredible things that I actually love and am interested by and are incredibly meaningful to me. So this is also like this is a big work on paper, like maybe just a little smaller than the projection. So another thing that really mattered to me is as I was like finding these images was that I didn't really want to make anything up. I wasn't interested in science fiction. I was interested in archival material and finding documents and then reimagining them through the language of paint. So everything here really was either an exhibit or a model that, you know, I would find images like photographs of the models and documentation of the models. Of the pavilions. It was, you know, almost everything was World's Fair related, but I would jump around. It didn't really matter what World's Fair, but kind of the scope of the 20th century and just finding these images and then breathing like a totally new life into them. And giving them new titles. This one's called Century City, which is a neighborhood in Los Angeles, but this had nothing. This was from a GM pavilion where called Futurama. What I started to realize is that so many of these pavilions, especially the ones from the second half of the 20th century, were sort of ultimately kind of paid for by major corporations that were really, so this is like GM, you know, Xerox, all the corporations that like surround our lives, you know, and like kind of in some ways dictate our lives, were financing these really imaginative visions for the future. And I think that really appealed to me from the vantage point of painting them in the future when the future is not looking so rosy, really. But really, I'm learning how to paint. I mean, I'm just having fun with paint and I'm just trying to figure out how to make marks. And, you know, the shapes are kind of just a vehicle that I can believe in enough to get to the task of painting. This is actually the Milwaukee Museum, which was built in the probably early 2000s, but I really liked, I thought the model for it was great. It's Santiago Calatrava. Kind of learned a lot about architecture in the process of these paintings. Around, at some point though, I started kind of feeling like, the paintings were, people really like these paintings, I should also kind of add. But they always used the word nostalgic, which I felt like for me, they weren't really nostalgic. There was something other than that. And I kind of wanted to distance myself from the making, and I got a copy machine, and the copy machine started to play like a laser, black and white laser copier. And I was always working in Photoshop, and like digital media and printing always had a role in my methodology. But I got this printer, and the printer really kind of took on a life of its own. So you can kind of see here where I'm printing out sections and I'm painting into them. And this is kind of like, it's not the last painting in this body of work, but it sort of was a breaking point for me. And these are collage on, so I'm printing out and I'm collaging it onto large sheets of paper. And painting into it. And then these are like everything else. Like the paintings are just straight paintings. It's just like oil paint. These are all oil paint. But as I start collaging, it's almost like I realize that I need to push. So I really think of this as the last one, and it's sort of like the image is just fracturing, and it's the dome on fire. If you think back to the earliest dome, it's like kind of sweet and representational, and like now it's like the image is just kind of like breaking apart. And that kind of ushers in the next body of work, which I call simulations. So still working with architecture, but they're getting more and more abstracted, and they definitely get colder and a little more machined. I made an artist book, the first artist book. I've made a number of artist books since then, and I love doing it. And this first one, which is also called Simulations, was just this one image of a painting, or the source material for a painting. It's actually the green and black painting that we looked at earlier. But I just wanted to kind of just keep copying it and making iterations. And I no longer wanted them to be recognizable landscapes. And I just started on a whole sequence of red paintings, and really getting into the technical, like how to make something look like a big Xerox or a kind of silk screen, but I think more Xerox is what I was trying to go for. And this is the 100% painted. This is like an oil painting. And I kind of developed this technique in the studio that like allowed me to mimic the kind of look of a Xerox up to a point. So again, I mean, it's still kind of a tabletop model, but there's, I'm really thinking of like visioning technology, surveillance technology. The images are a lot colder and less maybe sentimental than the earlier body of work. This is from a show I did in 2008 at Rona Hoffman Gallery, Simulations. I had a whole sequence. I mean, I made a lot of the red paintings. I really loved that body of work. This was a show I did about 6 months after in New York. This is my first show in New York at a space called Rental in Chinatown. And this show opened during the right as the economic crisis was happening. So again, you guys weren't there, or can't like in real time, but there was this huge auction that Damien Hirst did where he just made millions and millions of dollars off this auction, and simultaneously banks are collapsing, and it's like every other day, like JP Morgan, like it started, and what it felt like was that the capitalism had kind of just gone completely out of control. Like banks were over leveraged, and it started to feel like we were living like in a kind of Ponzi scheme. And even the government was terrified, and there were like daily meetings, and they were like, oh my God, the economy might crumble, like the biggest, most powerful economy in the world. And in real time for like 6 months, it felt like this whole thing is like falling apart. And it was, and I'm like a young artist emerging into this like super unstable feeling environment. And the show like did really well actually, but I think for me, I started to like undergo a real crisis in my own mind. And I really felt like what the financial crisis was sort of exposing. I'll wait till I get to the end of these. So people really like these paintings, but they all, like I tried really hard to make them look like kind of they were copied or they were Xerox. And then when I found that that's ultimately what people were like, no, those aren't paintings, they're printed. And that's really what I was trying to do. But then I was really disappointed with that. Like it kind of made me want to not keep doing that. It felt like I'd kind of accomplished my goal. And in light of what was happening, so this show opens like literally as banks are closing. And when this show came down and like we pretty much sold the whole show, it did well. And I just didn't want to go back into the studio and make more of these paintings. I really felt like there had been, like I had been living almost like a dome of like the illusion of the capitalist space that I had kind of grown up in and being kind of like critical, but also really believing in an idea of the system in the future. And I felt like all of a sudden, like the whole thing was just cracking and glitching. And there was this like almost like the illusion behind it was exposing itself. And it was a really intense moment. And I felt like I had to do, I couldn't just keep making, like there had to be a before this and then after this moment, that if I didn't mark it in my work and I just kind of didn't skip a beat and kept making the same work that I had been making, that creatively I'd be really doing myself a disservice. So I went into the studio and what I really wanted was for the aspects of capitalism and the illusion of capitalism to kind of start coming across more. And I felt like that it was always of interest to me, but maybe I hadn't communicated it in the work wasn't communicating that enough. You know, people just like thought, cool, like semi-abstract landscape paintings. And I really needed there to be more. So I had no idea what I was doing. It actually brought upon a pretty complicated couple-year period in my life. So what I started to just do were these like computer drawings. And I just started like cutting pages out of books and running them through a printer. And they were kind of, I wanted there to be humor. I wanted there to be something more about consumerism. And I wanted them to be kind of dumb, actually. I felt like everything I'd done up until this point was fairly serious. And I wanted in my own way to make work that had a bit of a sense of humor that I felt like the work didn't have up until that point. So I was just finding kind of like dumb books or advertising books, and then I was printing on top of the pages. And I made like hundreds of these, and my galleries hated it. They were like, "What the hell are you doing?" So there were like, you know, juxtapositions, like I don't know what painting that is on top of the LASIK advertisement. And this is like 2009 or 2010 to kind of put it in time. And there was also a kind of glitching that started to happen with like the scanner, like moving the scanner around and like kind of disrupt. I mean, what I thought of the overlays as functioning as like as disruptions to these images that we live with constantly. You know, like we're just bombarded by advertising, and now, I mean, with phones and like with our lives being halfway digital, like it's kind of relentless and insane how much we interact with kind of various corporate entities in all facets of our life. And I was kind of thinking of these as like ways to speak to that or to disrupt the images. This was a little show I did with a kind of wall vinyl and the drawings framed. So simultaneously to doing this, I also started to work in video. And I mean, there's a body of work I'm not really showing you guys, but in terms of like how much I disrupted my practice in order to kind of like open it up was fairly, there really was like a 4-year period of like a lot of experimentation. I think in retrospect, that was really amazing, but in real time, it was actually pretty stressful because like collectors were frustrated and galleries were also kind of confused by what I was doing. And so video, I started to also, so doing the collages, trying to figure out how to make paintings, but not really successfully, and starting to work in video. So this was the first video I made called Restoration Hardware. I'm not going to show it because of time, but I'll show another video that was a trailer for a show. So I did a show that was trying to kind of bring these various bodies of work together in 2012, maybe 13, called Permanent Vacation. And I made a trailer for that show. The function, but like I felt like that was like my art was the trailer. So I'm going to play it.
Are you looking for more meaning in your life? A sense of happiness? Are you tired of days that blend into each other? Are you feeling the grind? Do you find yourself sitting in traffic feeling the heat rising up your neck? Fighting with family members, co-workers, or neighbors? Are you awakened night after night by the noise of the city? Your health and happiness could be at risk. Chronic stress is a leading cause of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, heartburn, chronic pain, high blood pressure, ulcers, diabetes, and much, much more. Maybe it's time to get away from it all. Do you dream of a life where you can just get up in the morning, walk to the beach, have a fresh juice, and enjoy the sun all day, every day? Sounds like what you need is a vacation, a permanent vacation. Chris Dorland, Permanent Vacation.
I really like that video. And I feel like it sort of, at that point, I was kind of doing what I had wanted to be doing, which was like to bring humor into the work and to really sort of dive into like also just bringing digital space into my vocabulary. So I'm not going to show you guys a bunch of videos, but just to kind of, this is like just a couple of different stills, just to give you a sense. I mean, I have made a lot of video over the years. And this is just one example. This is kind of like what the shows that I was doing at that time were looking like. So it was a little painting, there was some video, there was kind of like wall-based installations. But it always felt like it wasn't quite what I wanted to be. It wasn't as succinct as I think I like my work to be. And so in around 2016, I think this was like the first body of work where I really felt like I could kind of make paintings that integrated everything that I was interested in. So I started like printing, and this was like the first body of paintings where I was really actually printing, not painting. And I was printing out sections in the studio using like a large printer, and then I was sewing them together and making fairly large. This is like 88 high by 100 wide. And again, like the red is kind of like a section of an old painting that's been like scanned and it's kind of glitching. And then there's like an ad, it was like a picture that I took in the subway from an ad that had been ripped apart. And there's like the glare from in the photograph. And this was a show that I did in Brussels in 2016 called Happiness Machines. And we kind of had half the lights out and we blacked the windows out with plastic, and there was a video playing with like really intense sound. It was a pretty dark show. As the work evolved, so there's no real painting here. Like the most I would do is like I'd put a lot of effort into how I'd prepare the surface before printing on it. But I started to get more and more into how I prepared the surface and what would happen to the images when they got printed on the canvas. This was in that same show, but in the basement space. So as this work kind of progressed along, I had this idea to just do kind of the same work, but try printing it on metal. And that kind of led to kind of a new, basically, I got the piece back from the printer, and I was like, oh my God, this is totally the way forward. And I like immediately stopped the sewn paintings, and I started this body of work called the Lumicore. And I was printing on this really reflective black metal. I found these architectural panels through something else, and I just love, they looked like the hood of a car, like really, really shiny and reflective. And I started printing on top, but leaving a lot of the black exposed, and really kind of pushing the scanning language. And I would set up these like increasingly elaborate situations in my studio for like scanning things, and how to like just generate these kind of strange images, and kind of almost started to think of it as really like the most collaborative with the machine, where like I was more interested in thinking about the lens of the scanner, the eye of the scanner, and how that perceives, how coldly that perceives the world. And I was using, I had a drone, I get footage, drone footage, and kind of a lot of transparencies, and just like really how to technically create what I felt were like machine-made images. And at the same time, also sort of working with installation. And so this was something I did, an installation in 2017 at an art fair. And the panels kind of were like 4 by 8 feet, and they were really, they took up a lot of space physically. And then I started cutting the space up using metal studs to break up the architecture. And simultaneously, I think I also found a way to incorporate video. Like, having been playing with video for like 5 years, I finally found a way that I felt video really integrated really well with this particular body of work. And so these shows consisted of, I did a handful of them, and it was like studs that were cutting up space, these architectural panels that were really intense, and then television monitors that were like leaning around the rooms. So I'm going to just play this one video. It's called Memory Cortex from 2017. They were really, I was asked to be in a GIF show that never happened, but like I made, it's not a GIF, but I call them GIFs. I was asked to be in a show about GIFs, and I made a couple of GIFs, and I realized like, oh, that's the best way for these videos to work, which is really short and kind of fairly like low tech, silent, and but really they were punchy, and that kind of just, I did a whole body, that kind of opened up a whole body of video work for me. I was thinking about gaming space and digital culture, and also like the relationship that digital space has to military space, both through games and but also just through the internet, and like all of it basically kind of coming out of technology that was sort of invented through the military. And like imaging systems, and how that kind of relates to our own daily experience in ways that we don't really think about. Okay, perfect. So this was the show that I did in New York at Lyles and King Gallery in 2018. It was called, the show was called Civilian. And again, sort of thinking of like civilian is the militarized term for like non-combatants, and thinking about how like, so I really, the space really like, there were studs all over, and there were multiple screens and then panels, and really like this show. And I sort of thought of this work as like relating to or thinking of like, yeah, the kind of grid of information that we don't see. Like we live our lives where we're kind of fully hooked up to various technology, but most of us don't understand how it works, and we certainly don't really see it. I mean, we all have the little things in our pockets and our computers, but there's all these other networks of cables, even the sort of cute notion of the cloud, which is like, sounds like something in the sky, but it's actually just cables running left and right. And I was sort of thinking of this work as like speaking to those invisible networks or how to visibilize the invisible networks that we don't see. Unless we're really looking. I'll just show kind of a couple of iterations of these pieces. This was a show that I did in 2019 in Nicoleti in London. And it kind of, there was a whole digital component to this show that I can't, for time reasons, get into, but there was the show, and then there was like the digital back end where I built a kind of facsimile or backdoor for the gallery, and there was like a digital experience that you could go through and experience the show, but like entirely online. And this show coincided with the pandemic. It opened like the first week of 2020, and the pandemic happened and shut things down. And I included in this show were like, I'm not showing them here, but there were a couple of small paintings, and they were a little different than the Allumacore in the sense that I wasn't printing. I didn't have a third-party fabricator printing. I had made some paintings in my studio, and I felt really excited about them. And this show was kind of where I was testing them. But once the pandemic happened, I really like fully jumped into, I had all this open time to develop these paintings that I kind of had just started to glimpse at for the last show. And this is sort of where I'm at now. So I'll show you guys kind of really fairly recent, last couple of years worth of work. And this work, I think, is probably what I think merges digital space and painting space most successfully in terms of anything that I've done so far. They're really like true to form, like painting. I mean, these in particular are really best experienced in person, where your body can kind of relate, like come up against the images and look at them and kind of think about how they are put together. This was a show I did in 2021, A New Day at Lyles and King Gallery. It was paintings and video. I will show you guys there were 2 videos in that show. This is the video that I'm going to show, called Species 3. I had gotten a grant to develop that octopus. And so much of these paintings have to do with skins, and the sort of octopus really was this like great metaphor for like the tentacular space that is kind of digital networks, and also sort of starting to think about like artificial intelligence and like what that might look like if it had a form, or like the goo, like something I think with these paintings, I find myself thinking in like maybe the most abstract way, where I'm thinking not necessarily in clear sentences, but I'm thinking of substances, and I'm thinking of materials, and I'm thinking of layers, you know, like the images almost functioning like viruses. That I develop everything still online, on the computer for these works, and then I think of them as having no bodies, and what they're doing is they're trying to find physical bodies to attach themselves to, and the painting space and the history of painting kind of becomes the body that these digital files kind of can graft onto, almost like host bodies, and then they kind of get to live on in real space, but at their source, they're really just non-existent digital files that, you know, are just lines of code at their essence. But then I kind of bring them to life by making these paintings. And that's kind of where my role is in conjuring the paintings, if that makes sense. And the octopus to me was really like the kind of, I don't know, like the central nervous system of like where these images could come from. And this is from a show I did in Belgium at Super Dakota in 2021, Protocol. And these paintings kind of function, they really, I mean, in some ways I think of them as abstractions, but they're not really abstract, because when you get up to the surfaces, there's like lines of code, there's tons of visual information, but as a whole, they kind of function like these big data scrapes is kind of what I think of them as. This is from my most recent show in New York at Lyles and King in 2023, Shell Code.
It's pretty thick on these, right?
Yeah, as I kind of figure out how to make them, they seem to be getting like thicker and thicker and more embodied. It's funny because these are sort of like, I think, yeah, like I said, the most successful merger of like digital space and physical space, but really where these really pay off in person, you know, far more than they do in image. They actually, for works that are part digital, I think they definitely function much better when you're relating to them in real life. Like yeah, the ridges are sort of getting thicker and thicker. And I kind of also think of these works as like a metaphor for our own increasing inability to sort of tell the difference between reality and you know, digital space or even non-reality. And it seems to me at least like that, you know, that just seems to be like a crisis of our age, you know, which is that like reality is kind of disappearing, or like everybody has their own reality, or it's really up for grabs. And you know, in their own small way, I feel like the paintings kind of like there's a moment on a surface where like that's happening, and the eye kind of fails to distinguish, and you can't really look at these and figure out what, you know, the really fun games, I think, to play with the viewer, because the eye can't really, even I forget, I'm like, wait, how did that happen?
Can you say more about the marks themselves, like how like the scraping is oil and printed? to build up?
Yeah, I mean, I like to kind of describe them as like plastic on plastic. I mean, there's no way, this is entirely polymer-based practice. There's no, you know, it's all acrylics and pigment and then some printing. And you know, I've kind of I never loved to talk about my process. I kind of feel I think of painting as like the kind of not quite the domain of magic, but I think that like we live in a world where it's like really common for people to like, oh, come into my studio, let me show you, like, let me make a video about how I made this. And I've always preferred to be a little more sort of keeping that to myself, because I sort of think that, and as somebody who's studied really a lot of painting and like really gone down rabbit holes to try to figure out how things are made, I think that's like, I mean, there's two types of people. There's the people in the world who couldn't care less how a thing is made, and that's most people. And then there's artists who are fascinated with how things are made. And I think that, you know, what's exciting is to inspire, like, you know, like I would hope, or like that could be a hope for these works, that like someone says like, how the hell did he make this? This is possible to make this, and like, let me figure out if that inspires you enough to figure out how to make a version of it, or, you know, and like I just as a small anecdote, but there's a painter, a very, very well-known painter who I know, and he has this one body of work, and I have no idea how he made them. There's some printing involved, and I know him and I could ask him, but like I would never ask him. Like, and periodically I'll just find myself Googling that body of work and just, how did he make these things? What is the process? And so, and I feel like that's how I learned, you know, looking in books, looking at Richter, looking at Polka, and like seeing and reading the materials and just being like, okay, like this is possible. I just have to figure out how to do it myself, or like, you know, like that kind of, that process is what really gets me going. But there's a ton of paint. I mean, that gets built up, and its surface is getting built up, and then there's kind of like a fusing, and it's all done in studio. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but with the other works, the Alumacor on the panels, it was the first time I had like a real fabricator making work, and I hated that process because you're doing something else in the studio. Like if you love to make things with your hands, eliminating that is like, you know, then you have like, you don't get to do what you love to do. But also it's fun to make things, and it's not fun to be like a corporate entity calling a fabricator and complaining about the condition in which things were received, or, you know. So it was really exciting for me to get to a point where I had figured out a way, you know, and I would say like practically like a 10-year process for me to kind of want to do something to get to where these paintings currently are. In terms of being satisfied with the project. So here's one where you can really see like all the little bits of information that is kind of like packed into the paintings. It's funny, and with these, I really find myself not even wanting to talk about these paintings. I feel like they operate so successfully in and of themselves that they don't really even need me to kind of talk about them, because they just do their thing and they're pretty satisfying in there. This was something I did at an art fair in Switzerland over the summer, and I'm actually in 2 months, I'm doing, this is me and two other artists, Jana Schimmel and Yen Li. But I'm doing like a solo presentation where I'm going to have this kind of reflective floor, and I'm really excited about that. It's like really big paintings and this super reflective floor. And so I'll kind of have two more images left. So in terms of like the screen-based aspect of my work, like I've always shown work on monitors, and I think of them kind of, they function like paintings, and it's sort of like, again, it's this toggle between software and hardware. And like in painting terms, the stretcher, the linen, that's the hardware, and the software is the file. And the file kind of finds these different homes to go live on, and they sort of come to life once they've found their hardware. And, you know, I've never projected work that's not really of interest to me. It's always, the screen-based work has always been that, like on these physical screens. But increasingly, as I've done a number of shows, the hardware, like just buying these TVs that are kind of limited in size, they can't really get that big, has been kind of increasingly like less interesting to me. And so this summer I spent a lot of time kind of figuring out how I could scale up the screen. And so this is kind of the first look. This is in my studio, but I've finally figured out a way to kind of get a really large expandable. It could go to any size screen. And this has been like a 5-year project to figuring this out. And I'm really, really, really excited. It's sort of like, this is the type of signage you would see like in Times Square. They're really, really bright. So this is some of the paintings I'm going to be showing, and a version or a side shot of this new screen, which I'm not quite sure when I'm going to show that in the world, but it's been so exciting to have that in my studio and to kind of figure out what the possibilities of that is. Yeah, and that kind of concludes what I have to tell you guys today. So thank you.